welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
So, I want you to imagine a completely surreal scenario for a second.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
You're sitting in your living room, right? Just having your morning coffee. And there's this loud knock at the door. You open it, and it's your local police department.
Which is never a relaxing start to the day.
No, definitely not. But they aren't there to investigate a crime or anything. They calmly explain that they're forcing you to sell your house to them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to pay for it, they just hand you a stack of completely worthless government IOUs. And when you ask them, why on earth they are doing this, they look you dead in the eye and say they need your future rental income to directly fund the Department of Defense.
That sounds straight out of a dystopian novel.
Right. But welcome to the deep dive. Because today we aren't talking about a dystopian future. We're actually exploring a terrifying reality from the 13th century.
Yeah, it's an incredible story.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack one of history's wildest, most desperate economic experiments. We are traveling back to the Southern Song Dynasty to examine how an entire empire, basically backed against a wall by hyperinflation and a massive foreign invasion, attempted this great reset.
A literal great reset, yeah.
Exactly. They tried to swap their failing paper currency for hard, physical land just to survive.
And, setting the stage here is crucial because when you hear about a government confiscating private land using worthless paper, the immediate modern reaction is just to scream about plunder and tyranny.
Well, yeah, because on paper it looks exactly like that.
Right, it really does. But to grasp the actual mechanics of this event, we have to look at the objective, desperate hardships the empire was facing. I mean, this isn't just a simple story of a corrupt regime stealing from its citizens to get rich.
Right, it's much bigger than that.
It's a story of intense warfare, monetary policy pushed past the breaking point, and really the ultimate test of the social contract between a state and its people.
So before we get to the government showing up to seize the farms, we kind of have to figure out the underlying mechanism of the collapse, right? Like, how did the Southern Song Dynasty get to a point where their money was so utterly useless that they had to resort to a massive real estate grab?
Well, to understand the collapse, you really have to understand the brilliant innovation that preceded it. The Song Dynasty was experiencing this incredibly vibrant economic period. I mean, they had a booming commodity economy.
Like massive regional markets trading goods at a huge scale, right?
Unprecedented scale.
Yeah.
But that rapid growth created a very practical bottleneck. There's a severe shortage of metal coins.
Because there's just not enough bronze and copper to go around.
Exactly. The physical supply of metal simply couldn't keep up with the velocity of trade.
Which makes sense. I mean, you can't run a booming national economy if people are literally waiting around for the metal to be mined and minted just to buy a cart of grain.
That's the core of the issue right there. The friction of using heavy metal coins was holding the market back. So the private sector, not the government, initially they innovated. Merchants began issuing paper notes.
Okay, paper notes.
Yeah, and they made these notes from the bark of the mulberry tree.
Wait, literally tree bark?
Literally tree bark.
Yeah.
This early currency was known as chubi. And as it, evolved and spread, it took on regional variations.
Like different brands of money?
Kind of. Up north, you had the jiaozi, and down in the south, the huizi.
It's just fascinating to think about the tactile reality of that economy, because transitioning from a heavy string of bronze coins to a piece of tree bark is a massive psychological leap.
Oh, absolutely.
So how did they bridge that gap? How do you manufacture trust in a piece of mulberry bark?
They bridged it through hard backing. Early on, this paper money was entirely convertible. It was backed by actual metal reserves or by highly valuable state-controlled commodities.
Things like salt and tea, right?
Exactly. You could take your paper note to a depository and exchange it for a tangible asset. And because of that strict convertibility, the public had absolute confidence in the currency.
Because they knew they could always get their salt if things went south.
Right. And from the state's perspective, this eventually became a massive financial windfall once they actually took over the issuance. They discovered the magic of seigniorage.
Okay, let's pause and unpack seigniorage for a second, because that's a term thrown around in economics that often gets glossed over.
Sure. So seigniorage is essentially the profit a government makes by issuing currency. It's the difference between the face value of the money and the actual cost to produce it.
Which for tree bark is basically zero.
Right. Printing a piece of mulberry bark costs almost nothing, but it might hold the purchasing power of a heavy string of copper coins.
That is an incredible profit margin.
It is. And as long as the state keeps enough reserves to honor withdrawals and, as long as they only print enough money to match the actual growth of the economy, seigniorage provides a very healthy, very stable stream of government revenue.
So they basically figured out the holy grail of economics. They have a booming commodity market, a flexible fiat currency backed by real goods, and the state is generating effortless revenue.
It was a golden era, financially speaking.
It sounds incredibly stable. So what throws a wrench into the machine?
The Mongol cavalry.
Yeah, an existential threat changes the math entirely.
It obliterates the math.
Yeah.
In the late Southern Song period, the Mongols are pressing hard against the borders. And to defend the empire, military spending skyrockets to levels the traditional tax base simply cannot support.
Because war is incredibly expensive.
Always. The state needs funds desperately and immediately to keep the army supplied. And when a government is staring down the barrel of annihilation, that printing press starts to look less like a tool for facilitating trade and more like an infinite ATM.
Okay, I'm seeing the Weimar Republic parallels here. They're just running the presses, printing cash until it's practically...
Like wallpaper, yeah.
Yeah. But inflation isn't just about prices going up. I mean, it's the total collapse of the social contract.
Yeah.
You give the government your grain, your labor, and they give you a piece of paper that they promise holds equivalent value.
Right.
So when they print so much that the value evaporates, they haven't just mismanaged the economy. They've broken their fundamental promise to the public.
And the mechanism of that collapse is just brutal. Because the state was printing money far faster than they could ever acquire the salt, tea, or metal to back it, the currency became completely unmoored from reality.
The backing was just gone.
Entirely gone. The overissuance led to violent devaluation. It actually reached a point of complete paralysis where the government literally could not issue new currency into the market.
Wait, they couldn't spend their own money?
Exactly. They had the printed notes, but they couldn't spend them because the public flat out refused to accept them for goods.
So you have an army standing between the empire and total destruction, and those soldiers need to eat.
Desperately.
But the farmers are looking at the government and saying, no, keep your mulberry bark, we are keeping our grain.
That's exactly what happened. The state has literally run out of abstract financial tools. They have to get physical.
Which brings us to an official named Jia Sidao.
Yes, Jia Sidao. He recognizes that paper monetary policy is dead, so he engineers a truly staggering economic pivot.
The Great Reset.
Right. In the span of just 6 months, he orchestrates the forcible acquisition of 3.5 million mercantilism numbers of prime farmland.
Okay, let me translate that scale for you guys listening. That is roughly 570,000 acres of land, seized by the state in half a year.
It's massive.
That is a mind-boggling logistical feat for a 13th century bureaucracy. And what did the state use to actually, pay the citizens for this 500,000 acres?
Well, they paid them with massive stacks of that completely devalued paper money.
Of course they did.
But they also threw in honorary official titles and, quite remarkably, ordination certificates.
I need to stop you there. Religious licenses.
Yeah, certificates for monks and priests.
Why would any wealthy farmer or landowner trade acres of productive income-generating dirt for a monk's certificate? Was there a tax loophole driving that?
A massive one, actually. In the Song Dynasty, holding an ordination certificate officially recognized you as clergy, which granted you exemption from state taxation and, crucially, exemption from corvée labor.
Which is the unpaid forced labor the state could demand from its citizens, right?
Exactly. In a wartime economy where taxes were crushing and the state could draft you for grueling manual labor at any moment, a legal document declaring you tax-exempt was incredibly valuable. It was a tangible asset.
Okay, that makes total sense. They are basically trading future tax revenue for immediate land acquisition.
Precisely.
But I'm stuck on the math of the main payment method here. Jia Sidao wants to pull money out of the market to stop inflation, right?
That was his stated goal, yes.
Mm-hmm. But to buy 570,000 acres of land, he has to print or distribute mountains of new paper money to hand over to the landowners. I mean, this feels like a desperate, twisted version of quantitative easing, just completely backfiring. How does dumping more money into the system solve a hyperinflation crisis?
Well, it's a great comparison to quantitative easing, but with a fatal mechanical flaw. Modern QE is intentionally designed to increase market liquidity to spur lending and investment. Jia Sidao was trying to do the exact opposite. He was trying to drain liquidity.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. His theoretical pitch to the court was that by feeding the army directly from state-owned farms, the government would stop forcing citizens to accept worthless paper money for privately grown grain.
Because they wouldn't need to buy the grain anymore. They'd just grow it themselves.
Right. He argued this would shrink the money supply over time and restore the currency's value. But you hit on the paradox perfectly. Because he used paper money to make the initial land purchases, he drastically increased the immediate money supply.
He flooded the engine while trying to siphon the gas.
That's a great way to put it. He deepened the credit crisis instantly. The inflation actually worsened, so financially, the Great Reset was a catastrophic failure.
But militarily?
Militarily, it actually achieved its short-term goal. We don't have the exact grain yield figures from those specific fields, but it sustained the troops. Years later, when Jia Sidao faced intense political pressure and suggested returning these lands to the private sector, Emperor Lezong flatly rejected the idea.
Really? He wouldn't give it back?
No. The emperor stated on the record that the annual military pay depended entirely on the grain from those repurchased public lands. If they gave the land back, the national treasury and the army would collapse.
Wow. That sets up a terrifying dynamic. Because the state now owns over 500,000 acres of farmland, and the very survival of the empire depends on the crop yield.
The pressure was immense.
But acquiring a farm is one thing. Actually, running thousands of farms requires deep, localized knowledge, right? Of soil, weather, crop rotation. Putting a government magistrate in charge of agricultural yields sounds like a recipe for immediate disaster.
It was. The descent into agricultural failure here is a textbook case of bureaucratic hubris. They went through 3 distinct management models, and each iteration was honestly more damaging than the last.
Oh, boy.
Initially, they set up what they called official manors. They essentially turned the independent farmers into state employees working under government-appointed managers.
Right. So officials who probably hadn't touched a plow in their entire lives are trying to dictate planting schedules to generational farmers.
Predictably, the official manors were crippled by mismanagement and a complete lack of incentive. Yields plummeted because a salaried state worker doesn't really care if the harvest is bountiful. They only care about checking the box for their superior.
Makes sense.
So when the state realized they were actually losing grain, they scrapped the manors and pivoted to the contract system.
Which means shifting the risk back to the citizen.
Yes.
How do the contracts work?
The government appointed tax collection officers to oversee the regions, and they forced the citizens to rent the land back from the state.
Oh, so now they're sharecroppers on the land they used to own.
Basically. But remember, the state is absolutely desperate for revenue to fight the Mongols. So the rent quotas they imposed were astronomical. It became mathematically impossible for the farmers to meet the state's demands, feed their own families, and turn any sort of profit.
Well, if you can't feed your family by working the land, the rational economic choice is to just stop working.
Which is exactly what happened. Vast tracts of incredibly fertile, prime agricultural land were simply left to rot. The fields went fallow because the economic incentives were completely obliterated by the rent quotas.
That is tragic.
It is. The state watched their vital food supply shrinking, and panic set in, which leads to the third and most draconian management model. The imperial court handed the entire task of agricultural rent collection over to the Judicial Commission, the Tixingxai.
Okay, let's paint a picture of what that actually means on the ground. Imagine your local FBI field office or the municipal police department becomes your landlord.
It's terrifying to even think about.
Right. The person knocking on your door to collect your monthly rent is the exact same person carrying the handcuffs, the weapons, and the authority to throw you in a dungeon.
Yes.
You have combined the prosecutor's office, the police force, and a desperate landlord into a single entity.
Yes.
The sheer terror of that arrangement would instantly vaporize any remaining desire to produce anything.
We can actually view this through the modern economic lens of capital flight. Today, when a regime becomes overly oppressive or economically unstable, we see wealthy individuals and corporations move their capital across borders.
They move their bank accounts, their IP, their businesses to safer jurisdictions.
Exactly.
But a 13th century tenant farmer doesn't have an offshore shell company.
No, they don't. In an agrarian economy, the capital is the human being. It is the farmer's physical labor and their generational knowledge of the local soil.
So they are the asset.
Yes. So when the Judicial Commission showed up with swords to extract impossible rents, the capital fled. The farmers simply packed up whatever they could carry in the middle of the night abandoned the fertile lands entirely, and vanished.
They just left?
They vanished into the wilderness or migrated to other regions just to escape the terror.
Wow. They literally voted with their feet, leaving the state holding hundreds of thousands of acres of useless, empty dirt.
Exactly.
Which raises a much larger sort of overarching question for me. Because we see this pattern repeat throughout history, right? Why do governments, when their backs are against the wall and their finances are crumbling, continually fall back on the belief that direct state ownership of physical assets is going to be their salvation?
It really comes down to the political psychology of power. Traditional history often reduces figures like Jia Sidao to mere corrupt villains engaging in grand theft.
Just a bad guy doing bad things.
Right, but his land repurchase plan, as disastrous as it was a proactive attempt to solve a terminal systemic crisis. And the choice of land wasn't arbitrary. In the Chinese imperial mindset, the fundamental legitimacy of the throne was derived from the control of land.
So it's deeply cultural.
Very deeply. Farmland wasn't just an entry on a balance sheet. It was the material and psychological bedrock of their authority. To own the earth was to own the empire.
It's almost a comforting delusion for a failing state. Like, hey, if we own the dirt, we are still in charge, regardless of what the paper money is doing.
Exactly. And this instinct to grab physical assets isn't confined to ancient empires either. We can fast forward to 1917, right in the middle of the First World War.
Okay, totally different era.
Completely different. Austria was facing a devastating fiscal crisis, entirely depleted by the war effort. And an influential economist named Rudolf Goldscheid proposed a massive structural change. He advocated for something he called returning property to the state.
Wait, in the 20th century, what was his underlying argument for the state seizing physical assets in a modern industrialized economy?
Well, Goldscheid observed a fundamental tension in modern statecraft. He argued that because modern states had been deprived of property over the centuries, they were forced to rely entirely on taxing the public to fund their operations, specifically taxing the wealthy.
Okay.
And this dynamic, he argued, guarantees that the state will be universally hated.
I mean, he's not wrong.
Right. The wealthy despise the government for constantly confiscating their wealth through taxes, and the poor despise the government because a tax-dependent state is almost always too broke to provide robust social services.
So it's a lose-lose.
Exactly. Goldscheid theorized that if the state directly owned and operated profitable physical assets like factories, land, infrastructure, it wouldn't have to rely on oppressive taxation, and it could finally afford to provide for the common good.
Okay, so we have the theory from a 20th century Austrian economist, and we have the brutal reality of the 13th century Song Dynasty. Based on everything we've just discussed, does the state ever actually manage physical assets efficiently enough to replace tax revenue?
History provides a remarkably consistent and highly cynical answer to that question.
I had a feeling you were going to say that.
If we look even further back to the Han Dynasty, there was a famous, rigorous philosophical debate known as the Discourse on Salt and Iron.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it deeply examined the effects of state monopolies on crucial industries. And the conclusion drawn by the scholars, then, is the exact same conclusion we can draw from the rotting fields of the Southern Song Dynasty.
Which is?
When the state attempts to directly manage physical assets, it almost universally fails the public. The mechanism of failure is always the same. The elites and bureaucrats tasked with managing the state's assets inevitably prioritize enriching themselves over actual efficiency.
The bureaucracy pockets the profits, while the infrastructure literally crumbles.
Exactly. The state itself sees very little of the promised revenue. The efficiency of the asset plummets because there is no market competition to drive innovation. And most importantly, the public grows deeply hostile.
Because the state isn't a neutral party anymore.
Right. The entire concept of a common good is shattered because the citizens no longer view the government as an impartial protector or a referee. They view the state as an oppressive competitor wielding the threat of violence.
And it is a phenomenal arc of history to examine. So to wrap up today's deep dive, I think the core takeaway is remarkably clear. When a state reaches the end of its financial rope, attempting to cheat economic gravity by seizing physical assets simply does not work.
It really doesn't.
You cannot save a dying empire or a modern state by replacing the invisible trust of a currency with the hard dirt of confiscated property. The Southern Song Dynasty tried to engineer a great reset, and in the process, they weaponized the police as rent collectors and completely destroyed the very agricultural base they were desperately trying to harness to feed their armies.
Yeah, the collapse of the mulberry bark currency and the subsequent land grab reveals just how fragile the illusion of money really is. And, I want to leave everyone listening with one final thought to consider as we close today.
Go for it.
We've been talking about a 13th century government physically sending armed magistrates to seize farmland because they had lost control of paper money. But think about the infrastructure of wealth today.
It's all digital.
Exactly. We are moving rapidly towards central bank digital currencies and programmable money. In a modern existential fiscal crisis, a government wouldn't need to send the police to your front door to confiscate your farm or your business.
Yeah.
If the social contract breaks down today, could a desperate state simply flip a switch on a centralized digital ledger to seize your liquidity? We look back at the Song Dynasty and marvel at the desperation of trading paper for dirt. But you really have to wonder what the modern equivalent of that Great Reset will look like when the capital isn't physical land, but just ones and zeros on a government server.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.